You just don't meet with the Russian president, just like you just don't meet with the American president. When you meet with heads of state of this caliber, there has to be a reason. His time is valuable. Why is he going to allocate time to Steve Witkoff to talk about Mark Fogel? Nope. It's because he wants to take advantage of Witkoff's access to Trump to receive a message and to send a message. And whatever conversation they had resonated greatly. Witkoff went back the very next day. Trump has a 90-minute phone call with with Vladimir Putin. I bring this up again because if you're acting as if what we're hearing from Putin today is the first time he's considered Donald Trump's position, you're wrong. You're fundamentally wrong. He heard Donald Trump's position back on February 12th when they had a 90-minute phone call where they exchanged ideas. This phone call didn't just happen out of the blue. It was they were both ready for it. They both knew what they wanted to say. They said it. They listened. And then it was followed up by a meeting in Riyadh between the Secretary of State and his counterpart, the Foreign Minister of Russia. It wasn't just them. Michael Waltz, National Security Advisor, met with his counterpart, Mr. Ushakov, and Kirill Dmitriev was there too. He was Steve Witkoff. You had three levels of connectivity there. Very detailed exchange of ideas, rather than simply Ukraine. I bring this up because what we're seeing here is theater. That's it. This is theater. And it wasn't just a meeting between Witkoff and Putin. Putin brought in somebody else, a name that nobody, unless you've been following Russia intimately, like me, nobody knew before this happened. How many people can honestly say that they who Kirill Dmitriev was? When they heard that name, most people went to Google and said, who the hell is Kirill Dmitriev? And why is he meeting with Steve Witkoff? What's the importance? Why is the head of Russia's sovereign investment fund meeting with the emissary of Donald Trump? Because they speak the language of international business and because Dmitriev was setting Witkoff straight on the reality of the Russian economy, the false expectations that Trump had about certain policy directions that could put pressure on Russia. You need to set the record straight, what can be achieved and what can't be achieved, and to talk about the potential of the economic benefits of a renewed economic relationship. This is broader than just Ukraine. In fact, the conversation appeared to discuss almost everything but Ukraine. Marco Rubio, when he met with the Ukrainian delegation in Riyadh earlier this week, wasn't making a final deal. Rubio knew he wasn't making a final deal. What Rubio was doing was beginning a process, but it was a process that was hampered by several things. One, by the Ukrainians themselves. Up until we're refusing to. How can you talk about a negotiated settlement with Russia when the Constitution of Ukraine prohibits negotiation? This seems to be one of those stumbling blocks. These are fundamental things, guys. Previously, they've been dismissed as Kremlin talking points, but they're not. They're statements of fact-based reality. 2, Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. Just not going to happen. Boom. 3, there won't be European peacekeeping forces deployed to Ukraine. Isn't going to happen. Boom. And we can go on and on. This is the reality that was set forth. And how do you proceed when, no matter what the president of the United States said, because let's just reiterate what Trump has said is some of the foundational understandings that have been reached between the United States and Russia. A, Russia didn't start this war. There goes the entire European narrative that this is a war of Russian aggression. Russia didn't start this war. Russia was right to defend its interests. This is a narrative that began back during the campaign when President Trump, then candidate Trump, was given horrible advice by his principal advisor on Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. Horrible advice. And that advice turned into policy formulations that were unrealistic, both in terms of timelines and expectations. Expectations about how Russia would respond and what America could do to bring to the table. But a reality check came in the form of Russia just refusing to even engage. Russia wouldn't pick up the phone, wouldn't talk. And the reason why is that they rejected Keith Kellogg's formulations out of hand. This led to Steve Witkoff, who is normally the Middle East envoy, being sent to Russia on February 11th. Why? Why would Witkoff be sent there? Because Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi crown prince, who was very knowledgeable of the Russians, has worked with the Russians intensively. Russia is, after all, a member of the OPEC Plus. So they have constant discussions about not just energy security, but when you're talking energy security, you're talking regional stability. I think sometimes people forget that there is direct connectivity, that you can't have energy security. If you're an energy producing nation like Saudi Arabia and your economy is dependent upon the price of oil. And so Saudi Arabia is very interested in stability. And they watched Steve Witkoff come in and seize the reins of authority away from the Biden administration when it came to the Gaza conflict. Watch how Steve Witkoff behaved and with the Israelis and with others, and was deeply impressed and understood that Steve Witkoff's authority came not from his knowledge of the Middle East, he has none, but his ability to be the vector for Donald Trump, to channel Donald Trump. He was very close with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump trusted him implicitly. And you make budgets based upon the price of oil. What you need is consistency and stability. And regional conflict brings the exact opposite, makes it impossible to balance a budget, makes it impossible to have any predictable outcomes. And so Mohammed bin Salman called Vladimir Putin and said, this is the guy that you need to talk to. This is the guy that can get it started. Unfortunately, we saw that Keith Kellogg's pronouncements were embraced by the Secretary of Treasury designate, Scott Bessent, who has become the Secretary of Treasury, who has made ridiculous comments about pressure that can be put on Russia economically, comments that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, bought into and repeated, and still in some ways continues to articulate that this is his thinking. We have to stop pretending that this narrative began in Riyadh earlier this week with a dialogue between the United States and Ukraine, and that somehow what came out of that dialogue was new and innovative and earth-shattering, and that Russia is receiving this for the first time, and that for the first time Russia is going back to the United States with its response. This is absurd in the extreme. The war in Ukraine is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Ukraine is just a proxy. That's like it, the defining thing. When you have the Secretary of State articulate this, saying, this is between us and Russia. We're the warring parties. Ukraine is a proxy. The United States started this war. The United States is the one who set the objectives of this war, which we know are the strategic defeat of Russia. And Ukraine is simply the proxy. This is fundamental. So because when you say that, you now understand the role that Ukraine plays. They're not driving this ship. They're just the proxy. This ship is being driven by the United States. Ironically, it's not just that this is a Kremlin talking point. I remember when I was put on the Mirtwort's death list and put on the Center for Countering Disinformation's hit list, one of the reasons why they said is that I was saying that the war is a proxy conflict between NATO and Ukraine at the timing of this, because about a week and a half later, the Ukrainian defense minister came out and said, oh, no, this is a proxy war between NATO and Russia, and we're happy to be that. Give us more weapons, and we will serve as your proxy. Guys, this has been known from day one. Only idiots and the mainstream media, I guess they're the same, have been articulating something different. So again, we have to understand all this when we try and put context into the statement that Marco Rubio used to initiate everything that you're premising this show on. But there's something else that happened too, because who visited the White House prior to Zelensky's humiliation? Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer. And they visited the White House. They tried to articulate Europe's vision of what's going on, which wasn't, by the way, a vision predicated on a ceasefire, but a vision predicated on continuing this conflict until Russia was defeated. And they met to talk about 800 billion euros worth of infusion of defense funding, getting boots on the ground. The French were talking about getting their nuclear deterrence deployed into Germany, putting air cover over Ukraine, war. And now you're Donald Trump saying, I want to bring this war to an end. If I only negotiate with the Russians without bringing in Ukraine, then we have a problem with Europe, because the strategic objective for Donald Trump here is peace and stability in Europe, so the United States can disentangle itself from the European web and reallocate diplomatic, economic, and military resources to the Pacific to deal with the principal issue of China. Again, let's just make things very clear. Europe was dead set against a ceasefire. The European posture was, we must humble Russia. Russia must be defeated so that Russia knows it can never stand up to Europe again. That's what they said. I'm not making it up. And so now we have foundational understanding of this conflict. So what is the role of Ukraine? It's an insignificant role. And we saw the way that Donald Trump treated Zelensky in the White House. Dismissive. It was an ambush, time to demean him. And there's a reason for this. What happened in Riyadh? We know Zelensky was in Riyadh. We all saw the photographs of him meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince. But the president of Ukraine, why wasn't he heading up the Ukrainian delegation? Why was the presidential advisor heading it up? Because the United States said Zelensky's not welcome at the table. Don't bother. We don't want you there. You're not part of the solution. You are the problem. Europe was talking about humbling Russia on the battlefield, that there could be no ceasefire, that this war could only end with a Russian military defeat, and Europe was going to be the one to ensure that defeat occurred. That was the European posture. What the United States did is trap Europe. That's what happened in Riyadh. It's not about trapping the Russians. Everybody, oh, look, we outflanked the Russians. You never outflanked the Russians. How do you outflank somebody named Sergei Lavrov that's been around forever, who's been doing this forever? Vladimir Putin, who's been the leader of Russia for a quarter of a century. These Russians are better prepared. They know more. They know about themselves. They know about the world. They know about everybody. This is not their first rodeo. This is not their fifth rodeo. This is not their 1,000th rodeo. They invented the rodeo. Then Marco Rubio comes out with Mike Waltz, and they talk about, we've agreed to a 30-day ceasefire when there are certain conditions that the Ukrainians laid out, but it's a 30-day ceasefire, and the ball is in Russia's court. Those are very important words. Why? Because immediately out of every capital in Europe came a following statement, almost word for word. We love the idea of a ceasefire. Wait a minute. Didn't you just say that there can't be a ceasefire? Russia must be humbled militarily, defeated. But now Europe's saying, we love a ceasefire. It's the greatest thing. And the ball is now in Russia's court. They said it. Everybody said the same thing over and over again, which means that this was scripted. Never forget that. Ukraine is a sideshow, what Trump wants to do with China. Not military. We talked about this before. I don't believe that Trump's looking for a war with China. I think Trump's looking for an equitable solution to the tensions that exist between China and the United States. It's a whole different negotiating posture and step, and I don't want to bring it up here, except to point out that you can't do that if you're tangled up in a war in Europe. And left to their own devices, the Europeans apparently were willing to have a war with Russia. That would be problematic for the United States, because now Europe is committed to not war, but a ceasefire. Europe has said that is the best outcome. That is the outcome we want, a ceasefire. Listen to what Vladimir Putin said. Ceasefire is essential. We accept a ceasefire. We accept it. They're playing the game. Now, here's the interesting thing about the conditions. They didn't send the ball back into the Ukrainian court because they don't give a damn about the Ukrainians. They didn't send it back into the European court because Europe, frankly speaking, took themselves out of the game the moment they said, we accept the ceasefire. They went to the American court. It's the second time or the third time they've heard this. Nothing new is being presented to the Americans. Nothing new. And they will make sure that point's driven home when, as Putin said, maybe there needs to be a phone call between us. And Putin has articulated these several times, and I'll just briefly summarize them. One is neutrality. That means that Ukraine not only will never be a part of NATO, won't be part of a European alliance that can be aligned against Russia. A pure neutrality, that Ukraine will not have foreign troops, will not have foreign entanglements, etc. Does Marco Rubio of course he does, because Putin, the Russians are clever. We can get into this in a minute, but the 90-minute phone call between Trump and Putin that started this whole game going forward, Putin articulated these terms very forcefully to Russia, to Trump. And Trump knows this. Two, that before there could be a ceasefire, all foreign weapon shipments to Ukraine have to stop. Because if you're sending weapons to Ukraine, that means that Ukraine is taking advantage of a ceasefire to rearm, re-equip, and prepare for a continuation of the war. Ceasefire from the Russian perspective means the war is over. No more fighting. So therefore, there's no reason for any more weapons to come in. And three, that Russia's territorial integrity has to be respected. And with all due respect to Ukraine from the Russian perspective, they had a chance to hold on to their territory and they blew it. They punted. And Russia has taken the matter into its own hands. And today, the Russian constitution stipulates that the totality of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea are constitutionally Russian. And the Russians won't accept any settlement that doesn't include the totality of these territories. I think that the other side's trying to play some negotiating games. There will be no negotiating games. So these are the three main things that have to occur for a ceasefire to take place. My bet is that Russia is going to say, yeah, we're all in favor of a ceasefire. We have conditions that have to be met forth. And these are the conditions we talked about with Trump, which is why, even though Rubio is going to be in Moscow, the Russians have said, we're going to have a talk with Trump on Friday, because they're just going to go straight over Rubio's head. And Putin's going to tell Trump what we said, we agreed to. Let's get down to brass tacks. Tell your boy here what the facts are, and let's go forward. The ball's in your court. What the United States has done in Riyadh is, through their negotiations with the Ukrainians, is to bypass this and come forward with a proposal. It's doomed to fail, but that's what negotiations are. This commits Ukraine to a ceasefire. Now they give it to the Russians.
So when you have a president on that trajectory meeting, that's the American president, meeting a Ukrainian president on his trajectory, and you bring them together, this is the inevitable outcome. Ukraine and the United States are on two fundamentally opposed trajectories. Ukraine is on a path towards committing some sort of national suicide on behalf of a Europe that is rediscovering its warmongering past. And the United States is a superpower, fully aware of the role that we have played in promoting conflict in the world these past decades, and finally having a president willing to identify the root causes of this urge for conflict-based hegemony and is actively seeking to deconstruct it. But Zelensky is more than just the failure of an individual. He's the failure of a nation, the nation of Ukraine, which is an artificial nation. So that's the other thing we have to recognize. The flaw isn't just Zelensky. The flaw is the national construct, the flaw that is Europe. Europe is a fundamentally diseased continent. Its history proves this over and over again. Napoleonic Wars. What do you think that was? World War I, World War II, the Balkan conflict, the war in Ukraine. It's part of the same diseased culture of Europe that cannot tolerate peace. Europe is a continent incapable of tolerating peace. Europe must have war. And because America was largely derived from European roots, we inherited that mindset. And we have tragically, over the course of many decades, been a nation at war with the world, because the only way to promote American hegemony was to do it through the tool of conflict. So this war means more to you than any other conflict out there right now. And so we have a president who says he wants to bring an end to this. I'd like to believe the world should be trying to give him a chance. And so this isn't a perfect president. America is not a perfect nation, and our policies are not perfect. But what I ask people to do when we speak of Ukraine is to become singularly focused on Ukraine for the moment. You have never witnessed a moment like that. The fact is, Ukraine is a symptom. It's not the disease. It's a symptom of the larger problem of how America interfaces with the world. Because we have a tendency, all of us, all observers have a tendency to become singularly focused on the drama playing out in front of us. And what we saw playing out live on TV was the most dramatic thing we've seen in the world of diplomacy ever.
They know what the 90-minute conversation was between Putin and Trump. So they know what the Russian red lines are. I think what we have at play here is a very complicated game of, and again, because they know how the Russians are going to respond, it is predictable as the day is long. This was, I believe, designed more to trap Europe than it was to trap Russia. And the reason why I say that is that Europe was talking about deploying troops, the nuclear deterrence from France, all this stuff. And so now the Russians say, ball's in your court. And now they have to go back to the Europeans who have committed to a ceasefire. And it's now a negotiation. And this gets Europe away from the nonsense they're talking about deploying security forces and things of that nature, and get down to the brass tacks of how do we get across the line with a ceasefire. This is the beginning of a negotiation, not the end of a negotiation. And instantly Zelensky says, okay, I'm for a ceasefire, certain conditions. And Europe immediately did a 180 and went, great move, ceasefire, we're on board, ball's in Putin's court. So Europe is now playing the game of ceasefire. And I think that's what the United States wanted to do, is trap Europe and Zelensky into this process. And now they're going to go to Russia, and they know what's going to happen because Trump spoke to Putin. There's no secrets here. Rubio knows what they said, so he knows what the Russian response will be, which is, yes, we're all in favor of the ceasefire. Hallelujah. Thank you. But as we have conditions that have to be met. The British said it. The French said it. NATO said it. Italy said it. The whole Europe said, this is brilliant. We're in concert. The ball's now in court. So they have bought into this package, which means they bought into the process. Now the process is going to go to Moscow, and it's going to be very difficult for Europe to disengage. See, the United States has sucked Ukraine into this. Now they're going to go and hit the Russians. They know what the Russian response will be, but they need to get that articulated in response to something Ukraine's put down. And it begins a larger, broader process of negotiation that Europe can't back out of now. We wouldn't allow the British to interpret the American Constitution. And with all due respect to the Russians, they don't get to interpret the Ukrainian Constitution. But Ukraine is the sole party that gets to say what is constitutional and what isn't. And then it's up to sovereign states to decide how that Russia's made it clear that they don't view Zelensky as the legitimate president. NATO, Europe, and the United States continue to view him as such. I think that's, in retrospect, it's the only thing that makes sense, because otherwise we're talking about two brain dead people up there saying things that they know have no significance. The Russians will not accept these terms. Putin has made that quite clear. Vladimir Putin, one of the reasons why he was so hesitant in the aftermath of 2014 and the failure of Ukraine to abide by the Minsk agreements, is that he was cognizant of the fact that Russia had made certain commitments to Ukraine, to respect Ukrainian territorial sovereignty, and that Russia would do what was necessary to adhere to these commitments, even if Ukraine was in violation of its obligations. Russia didn't say, okay, now we come in and do this. Russia, in April 2022, the Istanbul communique said, Kherson, Zaporizhia will be returned to Ukraine, along with the territory around Kiev, Sumy, etc. All Russia is saying is now, because of circumstances, Crimea and certain parts of the Donbass aren't going to go back to Ukraine because how Ukraine has treated the Russian population there. But the rest of Ukraine, Russia was saying, that's yours. We don't want it. It was only then when Ukraine continued the conflict at the behest of the British that Russia had to change its tune. So when Ukraine instead has this coup d'etat in 2014 and shifts to wanting to join NATO, that makes null and void all past agreements. And from the Russian perspective, that changes the foundation of their legal approach to the problem of Ukraine. Prior to that, and a lot of people don't recognize this, but the Russians are very legalistic. Every word matters, every statement matters. And this is why, getting back to Marco Rubio and Michael Waltz, they're in a lot of trouble, because the Russians recorded every word that Donald Trump has ever said, not only to Vladimir Putin, but to the public about this situation. And as Lavrov hinted, he said Trump has spoken very forcefully. The Russians have the archive of everything Trump has said. They haven't forgotten any of that, and they will deploy Trump's statements against Trump, against the United States, as this negotiation goes forward, because there's a lot of inconsistencies between what Trump has said in the past and how the United States is posturing itself today. This is a Western construct that buys into a narrative that says that Putin's seeking to destroy Europe, destroy NATO, and occupy Europe, to make NATO weak, to make Europe weak. When the conflict started, NATO wasn't on the table. It was about NATO expansion, but it wasn't about the existence of NATO, the future of NATO. The Russians did, in their draft treaty, talk about NATO withdrawing its military aspects of it down to the pre-1997 line. But that was a negotiating position, not a demand, and it's never been included in any of the prerequisites set by Russia regarding bringing a ceasefire and a termination of conflict. But Russia hasn't articulated this at all. It's not part of the Russian negotiating posture. Even in the December 2021 documents, Russia didn't make demands on NATO other than to pull the military capacity back to 1997 lines, but they didn't talk about the dismantling of NATO, the end of NATO, the termination of NATO. Oh, Russia acknowledges that NATO exists and that it's a reality that Russia has to deal with. But there is no linkage whatsoever between the conflict resolution in Ukraine and the future of NATO. I don't think this is be as complicated or as hard as people think it's going to be. It's actually very simple. The Russians have put forward some very basic reality-based conditions. When Zelensky is removed from power in the next week or two, the new Ukrainian government will be better positioned to acknowledge not only the legitimacy of the Russian argument, but to act in a manner which the Russian terms in a treaty format that's binding on all parties. That's just the direction I see this happening, because Ukraine is not going to survive much longer on the battlefield. The collapse of the Kursk salient is just the first of many collapses that will take place. Vladimir Putin alluded to it. He said, we are ready to surround major units in eastern Ukraine. No to NATO. How much more detail do you need than that? Because whatever happens has to fall back on no to NATO. So you've already started defining the four corners of whatever the agreement is going to be. No to NATO. No peacekeepers on the ground. No NATO peacekeepers. How much more detail do you need than that? Niet means niet. We can go on and on. And I think that's the direction we're heading. I think we're going to see the final agreement come in the form of a very thick, not that thick, but a substantial treaty-like document, because there are, in addition to security guarantees, there are things happening that have to survive in perpetuity. And that one of those is the Russians are insisting that NATO, Europe, the United States recognize the four territories of Novorossiya as being part of Russia, that this isn't going to become a Cold War type scenario where every map made in the United States and Europe had the Baltic nations in different colors and calling them occupied Latvia, occupied Lithuania, occupied Estonia. The Russians don't want future maps to say occupied Crimea and occupied Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Russia wants these territories to be recognized by Ukraine and Europe as being constitutionally and legally part of Russia. Britain's role in Odessa is related to its desire to make Ukraine their position to defend itself against Russia by carrying out selective offensive strike operations using drones in the air and sea, using guided missiles, the Scalp, the Storm Shadow, against Crimea, the Kerch Bridge, etc. The British have led a charge in this direction, and the UK has already agreed. Their prime minister has agreed that a ceasefire is in the strategic interest of everybody. So that's the strategic direction that they've committed to, is achieving a ceasefire. A key aspect of a ceasefire agreement will be removing NATO from Ukrainian soil. And this can only be done at the insistence of the Ukrainian government. And since the Zelensky government has invited them in there and doesn't want to see them go, the implication is, in order to get Britain to decouple from Odessa and that region, there will have to be a treaty in writing that commits to that outcome. All this has to be worked out. See, Russia didn't say no to a ceasefire. They simply volleyed the ball back and redefined the game. And left to their own devices, if this war doesn't grind to an end, you're going to see Russia put action to match those words. The goal here would be to get a lasting ceasefire and a permanent peace agreed to without Russia having to head down that path. Because once you commit to a fight, we see the difficulty in Kursk. Throughout the concept of a ceasefire in the closing moments of a battle, that if you don't finish the job, you might as well not have fought the battle. Russia needs to finish the job before they can get into some sort of negotiated settlement. I think we're going to see pressure being put on Ukraine to accept Russia's terms in the next week or so. And that's what Putin's saying. And the longer you wait on the east, the more you're going to get similar conditions set up there. Let's say the Russians surround the 3rd Assault Brigade, the Azov movement's great successor to the defenders of Mariupol. They have them surrounded. Are they going to agree to a ceasefire that says, and you got to let them go? You got to unsurround them and all this. There's nothing the United States or NATO can do to change that outcome. Russia has achieved dominance and is exploiting this dominance as we speak. And every day that goes by, this dominance gets greater and greater. So eventually the Ukrainian armed forces are going to crack. This war ends when this war ends, meaning that Ukraine will have to accept the reality that it has been defeated. And as the defeated nation, it will have to make certain concessions. Now, Ukraine can be artificially stimulated to continue this fight by your continued provision of weapons, etc. But it's not enough. Just remind everybody that we're at this point 3+ years into this conflict where the United States and Europe have poured in hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assistance, including the most modern technology imaginable, top of the line NATO equipment to Ukraine, and they're still losing. I think the goal of the Trump administration is to get a ceasefire and conflict termination before that happens. But the Russians know one thing for certain: no matter what happens, they're going to win. They're either going to win at the negotiating table or they're going to win on the battlefield. But there's no circumstance here where Russia comes out the loser. So I think Russia is more inclined to be supportive of the American posturing when it comes to the resources of Ukraine than they will be with the British, who just went out and negotiated without coordinating with anybody. It's still a secret agreement. We don't know exactly what was agreed to. But I will tell you this, that it has no weight under international law, and it will be unenforceable. And the British will never see that contract brought to fruition, because between the United States and Russia, that contract will be declared null and void. Reality. Trump just can't come in and say, Trump, first of all, is signing a deal with the Ukrainians that I think overlaps on the British deal. So it's not just the Russians are saying the British deal no longer has me. Trump's going to be saying the same thing. The difference is that Trump is talking with the Russians via Kirill Dmitriev about a broader economic cooperation that could include the United States helping Russia exploit its $7 trillion worth of rare earth minerals. The British are a joke right now. They're actively trying to sabotage everything Donald Trump's trying to do, and Donald Trump is a counter-puncher. He's also a man with thin skin, and he's very vindictive. That's not necessarily the best of traits, but when you know those traits exist, why insult the man knowing that he's going to counterpunch and come at you personally? This is personal for Donald Trump. He will humiliate Starmer by the time this is finished. This is why you see Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, and Tusk over in Poland, both backing away, saying, whoa, we think we want to praise Donald Trump. They're taking a page out of President Putin's book. Let's talk about the meeting that Starmer had with Trump right prior to that, where Trump embarrassed him, humiliated him, not once, but twice. The first time when he interrupted him and said, you think you can beat the Russians by yourself? And the entire press room laughed, because the UK is a joke, a literal joke. And then later on, when Starmer tried to intercede on behalf of Canada, Trump just shut him. I said, that's enough. That's enough. Shut up. You're done. And shut him up right there on the spot. Starmer also stuttered around saying that the UK is ready to back up the security of Ukraine with boots on the ground and planes in the air. But then he turned around and said, but we have to be backed up by the United States, which means it isn't going to happen, because we're not going to back that up. France immediately ran away from that. So did Poland. So did everybody else. Starmer is sitting there alone. Starmer's a nobody, a nothing. And he knows it. This is just political posturing that's taking place here. Put something else that Starmer didn't mention. The British signed this deal, a $100 billion deal or something, with the Ukrainians about the minerals, the same ones that Trump wanted to sign a deal for. And you're probably asking yourself, how can the Ukrainians sign 2 deals? They can't. I will make this prediction. When this is all said and done, the British deal will be canceled in its totality. And whatever is the Ukrainian government will sign a mineral deal with the United States, with Donald Trump. What was the first thing that Putin did when Trump got elected? He didn't pay attention to the idiocy coming from Kellogg or the stupidity coming from Trump himself. He said, Donald Trump is a great man, a brave man, a man who withstood fire, who stood the test. He said nothing but positive things about Trump. And that plays well to Trump. That means that Trump is, I'm willing to listen to this guy, to talk to this guy. But when you come out, as Starmer has done, saying that Donald Trump is a stupid man, an idiot who Europe must actively conspire against, Trump doesn't forget this. He has a memory like an elephant, and he will not forget, and he will not forgive. So they're all in a panic right now. They're desperate to keep the United States in, but they've committed so much political capital to this Ukraine fiasco. But the hilarious part now is having them all say, you got to go back and apologize. You got to go back and apologize. What I do know is that the British, the French, and everybody else were talking very big when they assembled this emergency summit about the need for an independent European security and military. And when they left, they're all going, we got to really work harder to make NATO. We have to pay our fair share so the United States sticks with NATO. We don't want the United States to leave NATO. We need to work with America, because the reality is, once they all sat down there and when the cameras are off, they all turn around and went,
Y'all got a plan? I don't have. What happens if America leaves? We can't let America leave. America pays for this whole thing. We can't function without America. And then if we really irritate them, they'll shut our economy down. What happens if they put sanctions on us? Europe is going to counter-sanction us. That isn't going to happen.
Your troops are confined to barracks. You stop doing bayonet training. Hell, you stop doing any meaningful training at all. Your tanks stay in because you're not going to fight large-scale tank warfare. There's no reason to bring 54 tanks out on the Grafenberg battlefield to work on getting battalions to cooperate with battalions. You may bring out 14 tanks to work with an infantry battalion in a peacekeeping scenario that was replicated, that you saw play out in Yugoslavia. But that's it. That's not high-intensity conflict. You worry more about medical evacuation than you do about closing with and destroying the enemy through firepower maneuver. You lose your focus, you lose your edge, and that's where NATO is today. Europe, NATO was constructed with the Cold War in mind. All of the infrastructure for NATO goes back to justifications that were created during the Cold War to justify large standing armies ready on a moment's notice to respond to a Soviet incursion, to go from 0 to 60 in a blink of an eye, 24/7, every day of the year. Then the Cold War ended and the justification for that went away. So what did they do? They stopped maintaining their armies. Their armies aren't ready to fight at a moment's notice. They took them to the garrison. There was no more training for high-intensity land warfare because that was supposed to be a thing of the past. But they maintained this infrastructure, this architecture. But instead of being cutting edge, ready to fight a war, it became a sinecure. You went to NATO for a career, and you got involved in the logistics groups, and you got involved in think tanks, and you got involved in conceptualizing a new role for NATO in the world. Today, you're doing everything but preparing to